We pursued this project because there was a strange turn of events. In the fall of 2008, few disputed that inadequate regulation was responsible for the mortgage and financial crisis. For a fleeting moment, there was a national consensus that deregulation had gone too far, and it was time for the pendulum to swing back the other way. But within months, with precious little evidence, regulations were put on trial for the lousy economy that deregulation had left behind, with rampant charges of job-killing regulations, regulatory tsunamis, and so forth. We wrote this book to inject some facts into a debate that has been sorely lacking in substance. We are honored to be joined by a group of individuals who truly served the public interest and did so with rare courage and foresight in a public service capacity. You were one of the first lawmakers to recognize the problems with mortgage lending when you helped push through a groundbreaking predatory lending law in North Carolina in the late 1990s. You then introduced mortgage reform into Congress in the mid-2000s, long before it was fashionable. Yet through all of this and all the warnings, the bad practices multiplied, even as proposals as simple as requiring lenders to ensure that borrowers could make their payments were blocked. Only after an historic collapse of the housing market could reforms be passed, and not easily even then. Why was there so much resistance to such common sense ideas?
Because there was a lot of money at stake. I appreciate the introduction of all of us as being ahead of our time, but you know that Cassandra was not a happy figure in literature.
She ended up being killed.
Yeah. But that wasn't before sports betting or stock market. But I actually brought with me an article that I wrote in Huffington Post some time ago, but I excerpted from testimony on November 5, 2003, a witness for the Mortgage Bankers Association who just spoke glowingly of what was happening in subprime lending. It was making all this wonderful stuff possible for lower middle class folks. He said that through innovations in the mortgage finance industry and through various financing and risk enhancing tools, that would be credit default swaps, created for specific purpose of extending credit to our more needy communities. Credit-impaired individuals now have ample opportunity to obtain loans through this non-prime or subprime market. I mean, who would want to tamper with that? It just was such entirely a wholesome thing. And they completely dominated the debate. Subprime lending was entirely predatory. It was designed to strip people of the equity in their home as home prices went up and up, and of course everybody knew they would continue to go up forever. As home prices continued to appreciate, subprime lending was designed to make sure that that value ended up in the financial markets to be divvied up, not in the net worth of middle-class families. I think it took a financial crisis to get the reforms that we did get through. It was stunning to me how quickly the industry regained their footing. I mean, they were kind of chastened and kind of embarrassed about it all for about 15 minutes. And then they were right back, making exactly the same arguments. And they certainly did make the argument. The phrase that drove me crazy and all the other reformers crazy was, while these reforms are well intended, bless their hearts, they mean well, it will hurt the very people they're trying to help.
And I think one of the things that I really enjoyed about your book is not just the final chapter, but including the final chapter, where you compare all the rhetoric that was said around the time of the Great Depression and the launching of the FDIC, Glass-Steagall, all of these horrific predictions that what would inevitably happen with the types of reform that were instituted by FDR, and how it would mean the end of the American century, it would be the end of the country, we would be Stalinist, it would just be the worst. And of course what happened is we had decade after decade after decade of financial stability. There's this theme of the industry, and Brad, you heard it every day, I'm sure, during all of your 5 terms. Both of you ran into it in the biggest way. It's recounted brilliantly, not only in your book, but in your book, if I could say, the FCIC report, which is just this amazing historical document. It's just an reckless endangerment, which I recently read by Gretchen Morgans and Josh Rosser, whose name's of Fannie and Freddie. But it's these same arguments, these same tired, invalid, disproven arguments that any type of financial regulation will destroy the world. We waited too long for Dodd-Frank, waiting until July 2010, when so much of the momentum was lost. We had our boot on their throats, and we picked it up, we picked them up, dusted them off, and found every possible way in the bailouts to restore them to profitability, as I was told in Treasury, so they could, quote, earn their way out of it. And at that point, they refound their mojo. We passed these incredibly complex legislation, which requires complex rules, which just totally shifts the balance of power onto their much more heavily resource side. And the answer is today, as it was in 2008, as it was in 2009, it was in 2010, you have to go to the source of the corrupting influence, and that is you have to break the power of these institutions. And the best way of doing that is to break up the largest banks.
Well, let me just say that I strongly agree with Neil that too big to fail is the primary problem here. These institutions will always have too much political power and too much money to be sufficiently capable of being managed, of being supervised and regulated, and of being permitted to fail because of their interconnections throughout the financial system that would bring down the financial system if they were allowed to fail. This despite the efforts in Dodd-Frank to make sure that we don't bail out one of these major institutions. I think we would have to if they started to fail. And the other point that I think is of enormous concern is the Attorney General's statement that the Justice Department has hesitated to bring criminal and civil, I think, actions against the big banks because of the repercussions for the financial system and the economy. I know that the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, in our investigation, was given a mandate to focus on the causes of the financial crisis, but our statute also said if we came across evidence of violations of U.S. law, it was our obligation to refer those violations to the Justice Department. And we made a number of such referrals. The number has never been revealed, and what the referrals involved has never been revealed, and I'm not going to reveal them either. But this was years ago. We made them all by the end of 2010, or maybe January 2011. I have not seen anything happen on those referrals, and I became convinced that there was a philosophy within the administration, unfortunately, along the lines of letting the banks earn their way out of the insolvency they were in, that the banks had to be protected from the rule of law in order to preserve the financial system.
If a large bank was lying about its health, was committing that type of accounting fraud, and it turns out that they had a hole that was 25 or 30 or $35 billion bigger than what they were representing to the government's response, Treasury's response, wouldn't be, oh, you're not getting any TARP money, you're going to go to jail. Treasury's response would be, well, here's another 25 or $30 billion to fill that hole. And so for us, that sort of went to the core of the too big to jail phenomena, is that the desire at that point in late 2008 wasn't to seek criminal accountability for these institutions. That was not only not a priority, it was something to be avoided. It was something that was feared. Or maybe, the Federal Reserve shouldn't just shrug its shoulders when a bank engages in horrific money laundering for Al-Qaeda, for the Colombian narco-traffickers that I spent a good portion of my career as a prosecutor chasing around Colombia, that the answer to that shouldn't just be a shrug of the shoulders and saying, well, what can we do? They're too big to fail. They're too big to jail. And that the Federal Reserve needs to say, you know what, that's enough for us to pull their ticket.
Perhaps the most striking thing about the oil trades is how utterly useless to the economy all that was. It was a synthetic credit portfolio. A family cannot buy a new car or add to their house or replace their roof or replace their furnace with synthetic credit. Synthetic credit is basically a bet on whether a borrower will pay their debt to someone else. It is simply playing the derivatives casino. It has absolutely no economic value. And I think that is true of a lot of what goes on in the financial industry and has been protected. It is actually not helpful.
The speculation has been very harmful to the people of the world because I think it has definitely created asset bubbles. For the last decade or so, commodity index swaps have been sold to pension funds and others on the ground that they should diversify into commodities. Well, the impact of that is to have tremendous buy pressure. All these people who are, in effect, speculating, gambling on commodities are gambling that the price is going to go up. And when you have tremendous pressures going into the futures market, going into the over-the-counter derivatives market, of demand for instruments that say the price is going up, the price does go up. Energy, basic food products are in effect being manipulated by this pressure, and asset bubbles are created occasionally. We had enormous ones in 2008 that harm the people of the world.
We're losing in the rulemaking process. Reform point of view is losing. I mentioned earlier the study of all the comments just on one rule, one big important rule, the Volcker rule, and how lopsided the comment was on behalf of industry. And even others who were in other financial market participants, hedge funds, private equity, who do see their interests as very adverse to the biggest banks, are kind of afraid to take them on. And they're kind of the bullies on the playground. And it has been enormously lopsided. The District of Columbia Circuit is supposedly the standard for turning over a regulation adopted through the APA, through the public comment and all that. Supposedly it's supposed to be overturned only if it's arbitrary and capricious. In my experience in practicing law, arbitrary and capricious meant plaintiff loses. It is almost impossible to overturn something on an arbitrary and capricious test. The D.C. Circuit applies the arbitrary and capricious test to be basically, did the guys at the Federalist Society meeting think that this is a good idea?
I do think the cost-benefit analysis that's become such a popular part of the rule-making process is a horrendous mistake. In looking at cost-benefit, the courts, certainly not the D.C. Circuit, aren't looking back at the millions of jobs lost, millions of houses foreclosed on, trillions of household wealth lost, trillions of government commitments of funds. When they analyze Dodd-Frank rules, they're just looking at whether it's going to cost J.P. Morgan 15 cents more a transaction and asking what are the future costs to the public. something that's almost impossible to answer on the part of the regulators unless they can point backwards and say, this is what happened when we didn't have it.
Which is what I thought the cost-benefit analysis would be, is how much did it cost to put that little notice in the envelope. But the D.C. Circuit instead looked at the cost-benefit analysis of proxy contests generally and decided that shareholder democracy actually was not a good thing, which was, it was kind of useful. It's kind of good that we did not have the D.C. Circuit and cost-benefit analysis rules around in the 19th century, or we never would have gotten regular elections or freedom of the press through. It would have failed the cost-benefit analysis. Really, something's got to give a little bit. Right now, it's frozen. One of the bills that's gotten less attention is now moving to the House. Actually adds to the cost-benefit analysis, and that's one of the things Republicans want to do all the time, is toughen up cost-benefit analysis, is that an agency has to show not only that the rule has a favorable cost-benefit analysis, but that it is the most cost-effective of all the options available to the regulatory agency. That is absolutely an impossible standard. That means that no agency would ever be able to adopt a rule.
Well, I think things have gotten worse today than they were in the late 1990s. But it was not an easy chore then. I mean, there was plenty of room for public comment and delays because of issues raised. One of the things I don't think we've talked about here is the degree to which the financial services industry has captive economists, captive accountants, captive lawyers who may have great academic credentials but are essentially in the pay of the industry, who are doing studies, preparing arguments, and doing things to try to complicate, delay, and scuttle rulemaking. And it was very disturbing to me to see staff people actually secretly giving out no action letters that if the commissioners had seen them would never have been approved because they were trying to curry favor with potential employers. I personally think there's a real problem recruiting good people into the agencies. They need to be paid well, they need to have good educational backgrounds, good experience, but I think there should be a rule that for the first 10 years you leave an agency, you do not go to the regulated industry. Because I saw too many of the staff when I began to put pressures on them to enforce or implement the laws. They did leave and go to law firms that were essentially in the hire of the industry that we were regulating. The deregulatory pressures, at least in the financial area, that have occurred in the last 30 years, there is some real weakness. I mean, I had 680 staff people and a small budget. Interestingly enough, Gary Gensler today, although the regulated futures exchanges have increased fivefold, has 10% more staff than I did only, and is supposed to take on $300 trillion market and regulate it for the first time. But I think that the pressures from the industry and from everybody having bought in to deregulation were really overwhelming. I mean, each and every other financial regulator, rather than saying, let us help you and let us all decide, you know, what should be done with this enormous emerging new market, were just opposed, said you shouldn't even ask questions about this. I was worried. Larry Summers told me that by asking any questions about this, I was risking the worst financial crisis since World War II. Which, of course, by not asking any questions, we actually suffered the worst financial crisis since World War II. And the policymakers, the Congress, if Alan Greenspan and Bob Rubin and all the industry, all the big investment banks and all the big bank holding companies were saying that this was absurd, that the marketplace would regulate itself, that I didn't know what I was talking about, it was hard to get traction.
I'm curious about what the ordinary citizen might take away from your discussion today. Why wouldn't they go into a tailspin of despair? I mean, you've outlined regulatory capture. You just mentioned a nomination process that is just terribly broken. You've mentioned Eric Holder's comment, we can't even sue big banks because of the collateral consequences. So why shouldn't an ordinary citizen just decide, well, this is nothing we can do, just, we resign ourselves to this?
Well, I hope the ordinary citizens stand up and demand more from their policymakers. I mean, I was pleased to see the Occupy movement start. I think it's time for activism. I think people should take to the streets and demand more of regulators, more of the administration, more of their Congress members, and they should elect people who commit themselves to do more.
Despair, sure, there should be despair. People should feel despair, and but they should turn that despair into anger and activism, not curling up and rolling over. And the thought that we're powerless, that there's no public voice. Look how much this debate has changed in the 2 years since I've stepped down. The idea of breaking up the banks was kind of a crank thing that Tom Honig has been talking about for years, and Simon Johnson is out there saying it. And now look at how much it is such an integral part of the debate. And part of that is because there's a lot of angry people who have come out and who support this notion, who understand that they're being victimized. So there's no time to curl into a veto position. That's not what we do in this country.
Here's the grassroots. I can tell you the grassroots are exhausted. They don't know where to turn. They are confused. And I promise to make the question short. If you had to focus us on one thing that we could do now, and maybe you don't decide that now, but maybe just briefly just discuss it, and perhaps Public Citizen takes it up, one thing we can do.
I think that Democrats need to be willing to be Democrats. I know this is not necessarily a partisan setting. I know how all of you voted, but Americans know that we have a party of the rich. It is the Republican Party. I think it is a measure of their greed that they really want two parties. They really want both parties. Traditionally, the other party, the Democratic Party, has been the party of everybody else. And I think that the Democratic Party has failed in that over the last generation. We wanted to sound reasonable. We wanted to sound sophisticated. We wanted the approval of all of the masters of the universe. But we really need to, before we can reclaim American politics, I think we need to have a party that does speak for the concerns of most Americans. In the although there were different wings of the Democratic Party, it could have been somebody besides Roosevelt, it could have been John W. Davis. It could have gone differently for us back then. But I think we need to have a president who has the self-confidence not to need the approval of the sophisticated people.
And among all that, every American should go out and buy reality check. And if you happen to be at Amazon at the time and you see bailout, you can get that.
You should really buy bailout, and you should read the FPIC report, which is available Great. So on that note of semi-despair, I want to just thank our panel. We were really, truly honored to have you here, and thank you for an illuminating and fascinating discussion, and ask if we can have